Hey class, in this third lecture, we're going to talk about the reality of the moral law. And much of this lecture is going to be coming from C.S. Lewis' book, Mere Christianity, as you will read this semester. So, the reality of the moral law, a law which says what is right and what is wrong. The first thing I want to do in this lecture is I want to talk about the difference between the law of nature and the law of human nature. The law of nature tells us what things within nature do. But the law of human nature tells us what humans within this world ought to do. So the law of nature does tell us that rocks fall. Okay, this is what we call gravity. The law of nature tells us that rocks coming off of the side of a mountain, they fall down. But notice it does not tell us if the rock should have fallen. It's not supposed to do that. And no one in their right mind blames the rock for having fallen. So the law of nature does not place blame. The law of nature just tells you what things within nature do. But the law of human nature actually places blame. And the word blame is a very important word that I want us to talk about today. Because just this idea of blame is proof that there is a law, a moral law, a law within each one of us that knows what is right and what is wrong. C.S. Lewis begins Mere Christianity with an incredible observation. And it's the thought of people, as he says, quarreling or arguing or fighting with each other. C.S. Lewis writes this, quote, "How'd you like it if anyone did the same to you? That's my seat. I was there first. Leave me alone. He isn't doing you any harm. Why should you shove in? He isn't doing you any harm. Why should you shove in first? Give me a bit of your orange. I gave you a bit of mine. Come on, you promised." So here's these people arguing and fighting with each other. And C.S. Lewis says that these people are appealing to some standard of behavior. Quarreling means trying to show that the other man is in the wrong. And there would be no sense in trying to do that unless you had an agreement on what was right and wrong. And then C.S. Lewis gives the analogy of a soccer player. There would be no point in saying that a soccer player had committed a foul and therefore he gets a yellow card unless there was rules to the game of soccer. So, there's two things that we can be certain of when we talk about the moral law. Number one, that everyone is aware of it. But number two, that none of us, in fact, can actually keep this moral law. That is to say that none of us live the way we expect others to live. We don't keep the law that we expect others to keep. So, number one, we all know that there's a moral law, and number two, none of us can keep the moral law. Now, I want us to talk about a couple of objections in our culture, here in our culture today, objections against this idea of a moral law. The first objection is that right and wrong is subjective. That is, what's right for me is right for me, and what's right for you is right for you. And the second is this idea that what really matters is what's best for society as a whole. So I want to talk about these two objections as we really focus in on this idea of there being a moral law and blame being the proof that there is a moral law. So first of all, let's talk about what's right for me is right for me and what's right for you is right for you. I was in Thailand as a missionary and I was talking to a lady and I was sharing with her our story about how we came to Thailand. And she looked at me and she said, "You know, I am a Buddhist." And She said, I don't really understand why you felt the need to come here to Thailand. She said, I'm a Buddhist, and this is what I believe is true. You're a Christian, and that's what you believe is true. And she said, what's right for me is right for me, and what's right for you is right for you. And this is a very popular idea in our culture today. We don't want controversy, and we're going to talk a lot more about different religions and Christianity being a religion that's exclusive later on in the class. But we don't want confrontation, and therefore it's so much easier for us just to say, well, what's right for me is right for you. What's right for you is right for you. Let's all go home and let's just get along. Let's play. Let's just have fun and play together. Play fair, and it sounds really cute until you start to get into it and say, well, let's play fair. Like, okay, well, what are the rules? And the reality is that, first of all, to say what's right for me is right for me and what's right for you is right for you works fine until you cross my line or I cross your line. So when I do something that is an inconvenience to you, or when you do something that is an inconvenience to me, now all of a sudden it's like, well, no, you did wrong. So it doesn't work to say what's right for me is right for me and what's right for you is right for you. Lewis says this: we must not say that what one ought to do is subjective. That is to say, what's right for me is right for me and what's right for you is right for you. That sounds great until someone takes what's mine, because that was most beneficial to them. Well then, the moment I confront them and say, that's mine, we have to ask, who says it's wrong to take something that's not mine? There is right and wrong in the absolute sense, where no matter if something is convenient for me or not, it is either right or wrong. Now, there's two examples that C.S. Lewis gives, and I just love them because they really, really paint this idea of blame in a light where we can really kind of wrap our brains around it. So let's look at both of these analogies. The first analogy is the analogy on a train. So I want you to imagine that you get onto a busy train and you walk towards the back of the train, and there's one seat that you spot in the back of the train, and your legs are tired and you want to sit down. But right as you make your way towards that seat on the back of the train, in from the back door of the train comes another individual, and he beats you to the seat, and he doesn't even notice you. He's well ahead of you, and he sits down there, and you're disappointed. I wanted that seat. But you don't blame that person. Even though it was inconvenient for you, you don't blame them for taking that seat. However, if you were in the seat first and you stood up out of your seat because you wanted to grab something in your bag, and as you stood up to reach for your bag, someone snuck in behind you and sat down in that seat, you would turn around and you would blame them. They took the seat. Well, the first person took the seat and the second person took the seat. But you would blame the second person and you wouldn't blame the first person. Why? Because the second person did wrong. Well, who said that they did wrong? Well, you both agree that it's wrong to take someone else's seat. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to talk about what lies behind the moral law. And obviously, you know what I believe as a Christian apologist teacher, that God himself is the giver of the law. But the point that I want to make in this class is that there is a moral law. The reality of it is, no matter who you talk to, they believe in a moral law. The second analogy that he gives is, if someone were to trip you, but it was an accident, you would jump up and you would turn around, and you might be angry for a split second, but you turn around and you realize that person didn't mean to trip you. you wouldn't blame them. You wouldn't even be upset with them. You fell down and maybe you scraped your knee, but the person didn't mean to. Compare that to a scenario in which someone tried to trip you, but you saw it coming and you stopped and you weren't tripped up. Well, you would be furious. You'd be angry at that person. You would blame that person even though you didn't trip and fall. So these two analogies, I think, are just brilliant to really place in our minds this idea that we blame other people. And we blame other people no matter where in the world we are, even if we're across the ocean and we don't even speak their language. We blame them because we all have a sense of what is right and wrong. Now, the first thing that we talked about was this idea, the first objection is this idea that what's right for me is right for me and what's right for you is right for you. I want to talk about for a little bit, though, this second argument, which says that society as a whole dictates what is right and what is wrong. C.S. Lewis says that there is a moral law inside of each one of us as human beings. And as we'll read a little bit later on, the Apostle Paul says the same thing in the book of Romans, in his letter to the church in Rome. But in our society today, there's this idea, and it's becoming actually quite popular, that much of what we believe is based on what our culture has taught us. And first of all, I would agree that our culture often can teach us and can affect the way that we think about things. That's absolutely true. But to say that the sense of right and wrong is based on our culture as a whole is simply nonsense. You can't say that society tells us what is right and wrong. First of all, every society in the world over time has had different ideas of what is right and wrong in the sense of what is fair, what is not fair. There have been dictators like Hitler who have said that it's right to eliminate the entire Jewish population. Well, we wouldn't look at Germany in the 1940s and say they make the law. We would say no, that's wrong. By anyone's standards, we would say that's wrong. So morality is not determined by a group of people. The second thing I would want to say is, do we want the government determining what is right and wrong? Do you want to live in a government, in a society where the government determines what is right and wrong? Now, the government for sure makes laws. There's no way around that. But the government doesn't determine what's morally right and wrong. Just because a government says something is right or wrong doesn't mean it's right or wrong. And the thing that I want to state to you and me is no matter what a government says, right is right and wrong is wrong. And that is based on a moral law deep in your heart. I want to ask you a question and I want you to chew on this. Is murder wrong? Think about it. Is it wrong? Why? Why is it wrong? Who says it's wrong? What if I think it's okay? What if an entire government, an entire society says it's okay to annihilate a certain group of people? Is that okay? And hopefully you would say, no, murder's wrong. And it's wrong because it's not good to take the life of another person. But what I want each one of us to realize is that the reason we think that murder is wrong is not because the government of the United States says that murder is wrong. And it's not because I say murder's wrong. Murder's wrong because murder's wrong because murder's wrong. And there is a moral law on each one of our hearts that teach us that murder is wrong. If we ask, C.S. Lewis says, why ought I to be unselfish? And you reply, because it is good for society. We may then ask, why should I care what's good for society, except when it happens to pay me personally? And then you will have to say, because you ought to be unselfish, which simply brings us back to where we started. You are saying what is true, but you are not getting any further. Example, if a man said, what's the point of playing soccer? It would not be much good saying in order to score goals. For trying to score goals is the game itself, not the reason for the game. And you would only be saying that soccer was soccer, which is true, but not worth saying. In the same way, if someone was to ask, what's the point of doing good? It does no good saying in order to benefit society. For trying to benefit society, in other words, being unselfish, is one of the things decent behavior consists of. All you are really saying is that decent behavior is decent behavior. You would have done just as much if you had stopped at the statement, men ought to be unselfish. So we can agree that men ought to be unselfish. Not that they like to be unselfish, not that they are unselfish, but that they ought to. In summary, do we really want governments deciding what is right and wrong? It is not individuals or societies that determines what is right and wrong. It is, as we will talk in our next lecture, it is God and God alone. In Paul's letter to the church in Rome, he is preparing to explain how God has made a new way for us to be right with God. The new covenant, which is by faith in Jesus. And as he is building up to the good news, he talks about the blame placed upon even those who had not read God's written laws. These are called the Gentiles in the Bible. They were guilty even though they had not read the written law of God, because they had the moral law of God on their heart. And this is what Paul writes. For merely listening to the law doesn't make us right with God. It is obeying the law that makes us right in his sight. Even Gentiles who do not have God's written law show that show that they know his law when they instinctively obey it, even without having heard it. They demonstrate that God's law is written in their hearts, for their own conscience and thoughts either accuse them or tell them they are doing right. End quote. As Lewis wrote, this thing of moral law must be a real thing, not something we made up. There has got to be another reality. We shall have to admit that there is more than one kind of reality. That in this particular case, there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of human behavior, and yet quite definitely real. A real law which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us. And this leads us to our next lecture, what lies behind the moral law.